Before we continue, quick shout out to this week's sponsor, Moment. I know, a non-alcoholic drink sponsoring a wine podcast feels ironic, but for a non-drinking, taking a break, or I need to sleep tonight listeners, this one's for you. Moment makes adaptogenic mocktails designed to help you unwind without alcohol. And I'll say this up front, all of their flavors are genuinely good. Not good for a wellness drink, just good. I'm currently obsessed with a pineapple electric flavor, which I'm drinking right now. It's perfect for those moments when you don't want just water, you don't want soda, you don't want alcohol, but you do want to feel something a little, like a treat, and it actually makes you feel good. They use calming botanicals like L-theanine, ashwagandha, and lion's mane with no caffeine and no added sugar. So you still get the ritual, the can, the pour, the I'm done for the day vibe, but without the hangover, the anxiety, or the regret. Basically, when wine isn't the answer, but feeling good still is. You can check them out at the link in the description or on our website at winenotpod.com. And if you want to give it a try, use code WINENOT for 15% off or 30% off if you subscribe. So give Moment a try, because why not? It's the middle of the night. You wake up for no reason. No sound, no nightmare, just that strange heavy feeling in your chest, like something pulled you out of your sleep. Your room is quiet, too quiet. And for a split second, before logic kicks in, you feel like you're not alone. Now, imagine living in a time where 3 of your neighbors have died this month. Pale, weak, drained, livestock found completely bled out, whispers spreading faster than the sickness itself. And then someone in the village says something that was really unsettling. They said that the dead don't always stay dead. Here's the question. If vampires were just medieval superstition, why has every single civilization described them? And why does the story refuse to die? Welcome back to Why Not Talk About It, the podcast where we unpack the world's most chaotic stories, mysteries, cults, conspiracies, crimes, and cultural moments, one glass at a time. And today, I've got a little surprise for you. We're kicking off something new, a supernatural creature series. Each episode, we're diving into one entity, and not in like a goofy Halloween or haha folklore kind of way, but a real in-depth, maybe this isn't fake kind of way. So expect dragons, zombies, werewolves, and all kinds of other supernatural creatures. And in case you were wondering, these episodes won't be back to back, but will drop periodically, kind of like a little supernatural surprise. And today, we're starting with vampires. And not just Dracula, not just the sexy brooding ones with perfect bone structure and generational wealth. I mean the original ones, the plague era ones, the ones dug up from graves, the ones that show up in nearly every culture on Earth. So, in this episode, we're talking about where this myth started, why cultures across the world describe the same kind of creature, why things like garlic, silver, and even sunlight are supposed to matter, how vampires are said to turn the living into one of them, why they're always weirdly wealthy, why blood specifically became the focus, and the big one, if they were real once, what would they look like now? Because here's what I can't get past. Most myths fade. Gods disappear, monsters evolve and get forgotten. But vampires, they adapted. So let's talk about it. So here's where things get weird. When you start digging into vampire lore, you realize this isn't just a European Gothic thing. It's not just castles and capes and dramatic accents. Almost every civilization, and I mean almost all of them, has had some version of a being that feeds on the living, as creepy as that is. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, there were the Lilitu, female night spirits said to prey on men and infants, draining vitality while they slept. How horrifying. In Greece, there was the Lamia, I'm not sure, but it was a child-devouring, blood-drinking figure tied to jealousy and grief. And then we've got the Romans, who had something called the Strix, and that was a nocturnal creature associated with disease and death. And then if we move east, you'll find China's Jiangxi. I think I said that right. And the Jiangxi is a reanimated corpse that hops through the night, draining life force. Bleak, I know. But then, even in parts of Africa and the Philippines, there are legends of beings that detach from their bodies and feed on blood under the cover of darkness. So, yes, it's all horrifying and creepy, but the broader picture here is that it's different continents, different languages, and different belief systems, but it's the same core idea. Something that comes out at night, feeds on the living, is often recently dead, spreads illness, and targets the vulnerable. Now, sure, you could argue that humans universally fear death and darkness. That's fair. But here's what's unsettling. The details overlap in ways that feel specific. The creature is often described as pale. They're often bloated or unnaturally preserved. They're often tied directly to outbreaks of sickness, and frequently someone the community already knew. Not a random monster, but a neighbor, which, in my opinion at least, makes it worse. And again, this is the part I just cannot ignore. These societies were not connected. It's not like they were emailing each other. They weren't swapping folklore across oceans, yet they all still landed on remarkably similar creatures. So either humans across the globe independently invented the same blood-draining nightmare, or there was a recurring experience they were just trying to explain. And when something unexplainable starts killing people, humans don't just shrug it off and move on. We give it a face, a name, an identity. Now, before we jump to conclusions, I'm not saying there was a coordinated undead PR tour happening across ancient civilizations, but I am saying this. When a story survives thousands of years, multiple regions, and entirely separate cultures, it deserves at least a raised eyebrow. Because myths that aren't rooted in something usually fade, and this one didn't. I mean, we're still talking about it. So now the question becomes, when did people stop telling stories and start digging up bodies? So let's talk about it. All right, so at some point, this stopped being just a story told around a fire. It became something that people believed was happening in their own backyard. In the early 1700s, in small villages across Serbia and what is now Eastern Europe, something strange started unfolding. People were getting sick, pale, weak, coughing, just wasting away. Entire families would die within weeks of each other. And instead of blaming bacteria, which, by the way, they didn't even know existed yet, they blamed the dead, specifically the most recently dead. There's a documented case from 1725 of a man named Peter Blagojevich. I think I said that right, yet again. But after he died, villagers claimed he'd returned at night to attack them. Within days, several people in the village fell ill, and before dying, said that he had strangled them in their sleep. That's the kind of detail that makes you sit up. And Austrian officials actually investigated this. They recorded that when Blagojevich's body was exhumed, it appeared fresh. So there was no foul smell, his skin was intact, there was blood visible at the mouth, and his hair and nails looked longer. According to the report, when they drove a stake through his heart, fresh blood actually flowed from his ears and mouth. Now pause. Imagine being there. You already think he's killing people. You dig him up, and he looks not dead enough. That would be enough to shock anyone. So another case was the case of Arnold Paoli in 1726. It was the same pattern. So sudden death, reports of nighttime attacks, exhumation, a body described as preserved and ruddy, stake, blood, panic spreads. And this wasn't gossip. These were official military reports sent to Vienna. Europe became fascinated and alarmed, of course, by what they started calling quote unquote vampires. The word entered Western vocabulary around this time because of these cases. The term itself likely comes from the Slavic word upir or upire. It was used in Eastern Europe to describe a reanimated corpse that fed on the living. As reports spread westward in the early 1700s, the word morphed. So upir became vampire and then ultimately vampire in German and French publications, which is interesting because before that, Western Europe didn't really have a standardized name for this thing. They were demons, revenants, restless spirits, even, but now it had a label. And once something has a name, it becomes way easier to fear. Then fast forward to America. Yes, America. In 1892, in Rhode Island, Mercy Brown died of tuberculosis. Her mother and sister had already died, her brother was sick, and the community believed the dead were feeding on the living. So they exhumed Mercy months later in the winter, and her body was relatively well preserved because of the cold, obviously. But they removed her heart, they burned it, mixed the ashes into a tonic, and then fed it to her sick brother to try and stop the quote unquote vampire from draining him. But he still died. The things that people did in the past, just like, I get it, but it's hilarious. Like, did you really think that was going to work? But here's where it gets complicated. There are scientific explanations for what they saw. When bodies decompose, gases build up, skin retracts, making hair and nails appear longer, blood can pool and leak from the mouth, and in colder climates, preservation is common. And when we look at tuberculosis, it does spread slowly within families, which could absolutely make it look like one dead person was targeting the rest. All of that makes sense now. But here's the part that lingers for me. These weren't fringe occultists. These were villagers, clergy, government officials, military investigators, communities willing to dig up graves because they were genuinely terrified. And fear like that doesn't usually appear out of thin air. When multiple cultures independently decide the solution to unexplained illness is to stake a corpse, something is happening. Whether it's biology or belief, the reaction was real. And here's the unsettling part. What if the scientific explanation accounts for 95% of it, but not all of it? Because the panic didn't die immediately after medicine improved. The myth just adapted. And that's what makes this more interesting than just, people didn't understand germs. So now the question becomes, if it wasn't just fear, what exactly were they afraid of losing? So let's talk about blood. So here's something I personally cannot stop thinking about. Out of all the things a monster could take from you, why blood? Not your breath, not your shadow, not your bones, your blood. Across nearly every religion and culture, blood isn't just fluid. It's identity, inheritance, it's covenant, it's life itself. Even in the Bible, blood is sacred. The life of the flesh is in the blood. Covenants were sealed in blood. Sacrifices required blood. Even today we say bloodline when we mean lineage. Royal blood, noble blood, blue blood. We instinctively equate blood with status and survival. And biologically, it makes sense. Blood carries oxygen, nutrients, DNA. It literally keeps you alive. Without it, you don't slowly fade, you just shut down. So if you were inventing a creature designed to steal life from someone, blood is the most efficient symbol imaginable. But here's where it gets more interesting. Blood has always carried spiritual weight. Ancient cultures believed consuming blood could transfer strength. Warriors drank the blood of enemies. Ritual sacrifice involved blood offerings to God. There's just this recurring idea that blood contains essence, not just biology, which makes vampire lore feel less random and more intentional. Because think about it, if a being wanted vitality, youth, power, what would it take? The thing that carries it. And then there's the intimacy of it. A vampire doesn't attack from across the room, doesn't throw fire or anything like that. It gets close, it punctures skin, it feeds directly from you. There's something invasive and deeply personal about that, in my opinion anyway, which is probably why so many versions of vampires blur the line between violence and seduction. It's not just predation, it's exchange. And that's where this starts to shift from monster myth to something psychological. Because blood isn't just survival, it's connection. You share blood with family, you donate blood to strangers, you swear oaths in blood and ancient rituals. We've built entire metaphors around it. So when cultures imagined something stealing blood, they weren't just imagining death. They were imagining something stealing identity, legacy, future. And that's darker than just some scary night creature. Now, here's the question I keep circling back to. Did humans assign meaning to blood first and then build a monster around it? Or did repeated traumatic experiences, illness, anemia, wasting diseases, did those make the blood the obvious culprit? Because tuberculosis victims in the 1700s would literally grow pale and cough up blood. Family members would literally watch someone slowly drain away. So if you don't understand bacteria, what does that look like? Well, it looks like something is feeding. And honestly, once that idea takes root, it spreads faster than any infection. But symbolism alone doesn't explain something else that's central to vampire lore, because sometimes they just kill you, and sometimes they turn you. And that's where things get complicated. Okay, so here's where vampire lore gets inconsistent but interesting. If vampires feed on humans to survive, then logically they should just kill their victims every time. Clean, efficient, dinner is dinner. But that's not what the stories say. Sometimes they drain you completely, and sometimes they turn you. Why? In most traditional lore, the mechanics of turning aren't random. It's not just bite and you're done. The process usually involves a specific sequence. So the vampire drains the victim close to death. Then the victim consumes the vampire's blood in return. Death follows, burial, reanimation. It's not a scratch, it's not accidental, it's deliberate, which immediately raises a problem. If every bite created a new vampire, humanity would have been wiped out centuries ago. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8. That's not a subtle species. So most versions of the myth include some kind of restriction. Sometimes the vampire has to choose to turn you. Sometimes it weakens them. Sometimes it requires ritual, or it only works under specific conditions, like being buried or dying with vampire blood in your system. In other words, reproduction isn't casual, it's strategic. And in my opinion, that changes everything. Because now we're not talking about mindless predators. We're talking about a species or a being that regulates its population, which feels pretty evolved, don't you think? Then there's the psychological layer. Why turn someone at all? Some possibilities could include loneliness. Immortality is probably pretty isolating. Power, creating loyal allies. Legacy, so bloodlines that stretch centuries. Utility, we all know their strength in numbers. And love, which is a whole other conversation. So some myths even suggest hierarchy, so like elders, covens, ancient bloodlines that outrank newer ones. But the older the vampire, the stronger they are. So essentially, the longer they've existed, the more influence they hold, which starts to sound less like horror and more like aristocracy. And then there's the darker angle. What if turning isn't a gift? What if it's like a recruitment tool? Because if you kill everyone you feed on, you stay hidden. But if you selectively turn people, intelligent, powerful, useful people, you build a network. You build something sustainable. Now, let's zoom out for a second. If vampires were real, not undead corpses, but some kind of biological anomaly, turning someone would require something transmissible, bloodborne, viral, genetic. And what do we know that spreads through blood? Viruses, pathogens, and disease, which circles us right back to those early outbreaks. So then we're left with the question, why is turning almost always framed as intimate? Well, it requires closeness, exchange, consent in some versions, and seduction in others. It's rarely brute force, which makes the vampire less like a random predator and more like a selective one. And selective predators don't operate chaotically, they operate intelligently. So maybe the better question isn't why do they turn people? Maybe it's why do they choose who not to turn? Because if immortality were easy to hand out, we'd all know someone who never aged, right? Unless it isn't easy, it's controlled, and it's rare on purpose. And that brings us to something equally fascinating. If these beings exist and they've existed for centuries, why do we supposedly know how to kill them? So let's talk about garlic, silver, and why purity seems to terrify them. All right, so if vampires are these ancient, powerful, possibly evolved beings, why are they taken out by kitchen ingredients and jewelry? Make it make sense. So let's start with garlic. Garlic shows up in vampire lore across Eastern Europe long before Hollywood touched it. Villagers would hang it in doorways, rub it on windows, even place cloves in the mouths of corpses to prevent them from rising, which feels dramatic, but garlic wasn't random. For centuries, it was considered medicinal. It has real antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. Before germ theory, people associated garlic with protection against illness. It was used during plagues and believed to purify the body. So if you think disease is being caused by something supernatural draining people at night, and you also believe garlic wards off sickness, suddenly garlic becomes a vampire deterrent. I mean, it does make sense. It's not about flavor, it's about protection. Now, silver. Silver is interesting because it pops up in more than just vampire lore. It's tied to werewolves too. Silver has historically symbolized purity and wealth and divine energy. It was used to store water because it slowed bacterial growth, and in many cultures, silver represented incorruptibility. And if vampires are framed as corrupted or unholy beings, then silver, the metal of purity, becomes symbolic opposition. It's not just a weapon, it's a statement. And then we get to the crucifixes and holy water. Jesus, take the wheel. This one is more straightforward, but still layered. Once Christianity spread through Europe, vampires became framed not just as undead, but as spiritually unclean, damned, soulless abominations. So symbols of divine authority supposedly repelled them. And here's what's interesting. Deterrents vary slightly across cultures. So some use specific herbs, some use religious icons, or, some use running water, and some use invitations, or rather the lack of one. The whole, a vampire can't enter unless invited rule, which is oddly specific. Why would a predator respect property boundaries? Please explain this to me. Unless that rule was added later, unless that detail evolved culturally or it's symbolic, representing consent, boundaries, spiritual protection, whatever. But what's consistent across most versions? Purity. So garlic equals cleansing, silver equals incorruptible, holy symbols equal divine authority, and running water equals purification. It's almost as if vampires represented contamination or corruption, disease, moral decay. And the only thing that stops them is something considered spiritually or physically pure. Now, here's where it gets fun. If vampires were purely biological, garlic wouldn't matter. A specific metal wouldn't matter, and a cross certainly wouldn't matter unless the being believed that it mattered. So either these deterrents are psychological, they were ritual protections created by frightened communities, or the myths evolved as religion and medicine evolved. But let's take a look at this angle. If something has existed long enough to understand human belief systems, wouldn't it adapt around them? Wouldn't it learn which symbols scare humans and avoid those areas? Or better yet, wouldn't it learn to move where those symbols aren't present? Which might explain something. We don't see garlic hanging in doorways anymore. We don't keep crucifixes above every bed, and we certainly don't store water in silver vessels. We modernized. So if something fed on us, it wouldn't need to avoid medieval protections anymore. All right, so now let's talk about the sun, the good old sunshine. Because for something so powerful, so ancient, so allegedly immortal, vampires have a pretty dramatic weakness: daylight. And here's the twist most people don't realize. In early Eastern European folklore, vampires didn't instantly combust in the sun. They were nocturnal, yes, they preferred the dark, but total disintegration at sunrise, that's actually a later addition. In Bram Stoker's ever-famous Dracula, the Count can walk in daylight, and he's weakened for sure, but not destroyed. It wasn't until the 1922 film Nosferatu that we got the now iconic image of a vampire turning to dust in morning light. And once cinema decided that sunlight equaled death, that rule stuck. But the symbolism behind it, that's older. So the sun has always represented purity, truth, divine authority, revelation. In many religious traditions, light exposes corruption and darkness conceals it. So, if vampires are framed as unholy, cursed, spiritually corrupt beings, of course sunlight harms them, and therefore light exposes them. And what is a predator's greatest enemy? Exposure. Now, if we pivot to biology for just a second, There are real medical conditions tied to sunlight sensitivity. Porphyria, for example, can cause extreme UV sensitivity, skin blistering, and gum recession that makes teeth appear elongated. Some severe forms can even cause a reddish discoloration of teeth. So that sucks. Now, I'm not saying porphyria equals vampire, but imagine observing someone in the Middle Ages who avoided sunlight, had blistered skin, appeared pale, had very prominent teeth, and possibly consumed animal blood for iron. You don't think rumors would start? Please. There's also rabies, which can cause aversion to light and water. Add that to blood fixation myths, and suddenly you have a medical puzzle being interpreted through superstition. But here's what fascinates me most. Sunlight is universal. You can't negotiate with it, you can't bribe it, you can't stab it with silver. It just shows up every day. So building that weakness into vampire lore makes them inherently limited. They can't dominate the world openly because half of it is inaccessible. Unless the sunlight rule evolved because we needed it to. Because think about it. If vampires could roam freely day and night, unstoppable, immortal, invulnerable, the myth becomes overwhelming. There's no balance. But if they're bound to darkness, it keeps them contained. It makes the story survivable. It gives humans a fighting chance. And here's another angle. In modern interpretation, sunlight doesn't always destroy them. It just reveals them, makes them sparkle, makes their skin glow unnaturally, or makes their inhumanity visible, which is interesting because, again, light equals exposure. And if a being wanted to blend into society, would it risk being seen in full illumination? I don't think so. So whether sunlight burns them biologically, symbolically, or narratively, it serves the same purpose. It keeps them in the shadows. And maybe that's the point. Now, we've talked about what kills them, we've talked about what protects us, and we've talked about how they spread. But none of that explains how this bloated grave creature turned into an aristocratic night god with a bat side hustle. So let's shift gears for a second, because somewhere along the way, they transformed into something very different. Somehow the monster got hot, I guess, and that glow up deserves its own conversation. So at this point in history, vampires were not hot. Let's be clear. They were described as bloated, ruddy, swollen with blood. God, that sounds disgusting. Sometimes smelling of decay, and sometimes with dirt still in their mouths from the grave. They were associated with plague, wasting disease, and just death. No one was writing fan fiction about that. But then, in 1897, everything shifted. Bram Stoker publishes Dracula. Now, technically, Stoker didn't invent vampires. The lore was already, of course, circulating across Europe, as we've discussed. But what he did do was refine it, polish it, dress it in, tailored black, give it a castle and a title. Count Dracula isn't a mindless grave crawler. He's educated, aristocratic, ancient. He speaks multiple languages, he owns property, and even travels internationally. And suddenly, the monster isn't just terrifying, he's magnetic. Now, yes, Stoker loosely borrowed the name from Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century ruler known for his brutal tactics and impalement methods. Super fun, I know. But Vlad wasn't a blood-drinking immortal. He was just a violent political figure in a violent era. Stoker took the name, the aura, the Eastern European mystique, and he built something else entirely. And what fascinates me is why the version stuck. Because this was the late Victorian era, a time of intense repression, sexual restraint, strict social hierarchies, fear of foreign influence entering England, and anxiety about disease, immigration, and moral decay. And what is Dracula? Well, he's a foreign nobleman who infiltrates London society. He seduces women, spreads something through, intimate contact, threatens bloodlines, and just straight up disrupts social order. He doesn't just feed, he corrupts. And that shift is important because now the vampire isn't just a symbol of illness, it's a symbol of desire. There's something about the bite in Stoker's version that isn't just violent, it's intimate. It's invasive, yes, but it's also charged. It blurs the line between fear and attraction. And from that point forward, the vampire keeps evolving. And then there's the whole bat thing. Because at some point, vampires didn't just feed on blood, they started turning into bats, which feels theatrical, a little dramatic, very Halloween, but it didn't come out of nowhere. In 1897, when Dracula was published, Europe was already aware of vampire bats in Central and South America. These bats were real. They fed on livestock, they made small, almost surgical incisions, and they drank blood without immediately killing their prey. And to people hearing that for the first time, that would have felt confirming. An actual creature that feeds exclusively on blood, like that exists? Let's just assume that it reinforced the myth. It's also worth noting that bats are nocturnal. They live in dark spaces, they hang upside down, they move erratically, and before modern biology, they were associated with disease and plague. So linking vampires to bats wasn't just aesthetic, it was symbolic and biological. Some folklore doesn't even have vampires turning into bats at all. Instead, bats are seen as familiars, messengers, creatures drawn to blood and death. But once the myth modernized, shapeshifting became part of the power set, and shapeshifting changes the narrative. Because now the vampire isn't just undead, it's adaptive, it can move unseen, travel quietly, and it can observe without being recognized. And if you're trying to survive centuries without detection, that shit's useful, isn't it? Now, is that literal? Probably not. But metaphorically, a predator that can blend into the night, disappear into the sky, and feed without immediate detection, that tracks. And it raises something else. If the bat element entered the myth after real vampire bats were discovered, then that means that the legend didn't stay static. It just absorbed new information. It evolved, which makes it less like a fixed superstition and more like a living story. And stories that adapt tend to survive, right? So we've got the 20th century, which gives us capes and fangs and, black and white film. The late 1900s gives us brooding immortals grappling with mortality. And the 2000s gives us tortured, wealthy, emotionally complex night dwellers with perfect hair and generational assets. Somewhere along the way, we stopped fearing them. We started wanting to be them. And that's the real glow up. Because think about it. If you live forever, you accumulate wealth, knowledge, influence, investments, property, art, connections. Compound interest alone would make you a billionaire by accident. So maybe it does make sense that vampires are always portrayed as wealthy, but it also taps into something deeper. The idea of old money, old power, ancient families who've, been around longer than anyone realizes. And that feels metaphorical, unless it's not. Because if a being truly lived for centuries, wouldn't it naturally rise to the top? Wouldn't it move in, elite circles? Wouldn't it own property quietly under different names and generations? I'm not saying that your hedge fund manager is, undead, but what I am saying is that if immortality existed, poverty would not last long. And that might be why the vampire shifted from, peasant horror to aristocratic predator. Because the most terrifying monster isn't the one in the graveyard, it's the one in the penthouse. Now, that transformation alone explains why the myth survived literature, but it doesn't explain why it survived modern medicine. And that's where things get interesting yet again. So let's talk about why we have centuries of accounts, but far fewer public panics today. If we have centuries of documented accounts, exhumations, official reports, entire villages convinced something undead was feeding on them, why don't we see that kind of panic now? We don't have mobs digging up graves. We don't have government memos about blood drinking corpses or, clergy leading midnight stake ceremonies. At least not publicly. I don't know about them, at least. But what changed? And I think that the obvious answer is medicine. I mean, think about it. We now understand bacteria, viruses, tuberculosis, anemia. We can test blood. We can explain decomposition. We don't look at a preserved corpse and assume it just got up for a midnight snack. Science closed a lot of the gaps that superstition once filled. That's reasonable. right? I think that's reasonable. But the myth didn't disappear when medicine improved, it evolved. Instead of village panic, we now get subculture. There are real vampire communities today. I don't know if you guys knew that, but there are, especially in cities like New Orleans, Atlanta, New York, people who identify as something called sanguinarians. And sanguinarians are people who claim to experience physical lethargy, brain fog, or illness if they don't consume small amounts of blood from consenting donors. And before we roll our eyes, some of these communities have structured ethical systems. I mean, they have like contracts, health screenings, privacy rules, hierarchies. They're not hiding in crypts, they're in apartments. Now, is that psychological, ritualistic, identity based? Possibly. But the existence of organized modern vampire communities tells us something important, that the archetype still resonates. And then there's this angle. What if public panic decreased not because vampires vanished, but because society changed? Think about medieval villages, small populations, everyone knows everyone. When, three people get sick in a row, it's noticeable. It's personal and feels targeted. Now think about modern cities. Millions of people, anemia diagnoses every day, chronic illnesses everywhere. We don't attribute patterns to neighbors. We attribute them to lab results, right? Urban anonymity swallows anomalies. If something were feeding quietly, hypothetically, would it operate in a rural village with 200 people or in a city of 8 million? And then there's adaptation. If a species had centuries to refine its survival strategy, wouldn't it learn from the past? I think so. Public panic is just bad for business. So maybe they stopped overfeeding. Maybe they fed less frequently or fed on animals. They blend into nightlife culture or integrate into wealth and power structures or simply just avoid patterns. Because here's the thing, the historical accounts often describe outbreaks, multiple deaths clustered together, and that is sloppy. A predator that survives centuries does not stay sloppy. It learns and adapts. Or, and this is the boring answer, of course, the panic stopped because fear found new outlets. Instead of vampires, we blame viruses, corporations, governments, billionaires, systems that, quote unquote, drain us, which is fascinating in its own way. Because even in modern slang, what do we call someone emotionally exhausting? We call them an energy vampire. The language never left. We just updated the metaphor. So, if something had existed for hundreds of years, long enough to accumulate wealth, power, and anonymity, would it announce itself? Or would it just disappear into, boardrooms and penthouses? Again, I'm not saying your CEO is undead. I'm just saying if immortality were real, the smartest move wouldn't be hiding in a coffin. It would be integration. And that possibility, even if it's just narrative, explains why the myth never fully fades. Because instead of asking, are vampires real? The better question might be, if they were, how would we even know? So let's zoom out. Because whether they're biological, metaphorical, or something in between, the fact that this story refuses to die says something about us. And that's where this gets deeper than just, fangs and capes. Let's talk about why this myth won't stay buried. So let's step back for a second. Because whether vampires are biological anomalies, misunderstood disease, elite metaphors, or just very committed fan fiction, the real mystery is this. Why has this story survived everything? Empires collapsed, gods were forgotten, entire mythologies faded into footnotes. But vampires, they adapted. In the 1700s, they explained disease. In the Victorian era, they embodied repression and forbidden desire. In the 20th century, they became cinematic horror. And in the 2000s, they became romantic anti-heroes. Now, they're billion-dollar franchises, streaming series, fan conventions, entire aesthetic subcultures. We don't just fear them, we market them. And that says something. Because at its core, the vampire myth taps into two things that humans have never resolved: fear of death and obsession with immortality. Can I get an amen? Now, the earliest versions were about losing life unexpectedly, watching someone waste away, pale and drained. The modern versions are about refusing to lose life at all. We don't want to die, we don't want to age, and we certainly don't want to become irrelevant, right? Can you imagine? And what is a vampire if not eternal youth? Flawless skin, endless time, unlimited wealth accumulation, and centuries to perfect your craft, your charm, and your investments. It's aspirational now, which is wild because this creature started as a bloated corpse blamed for plague outbreaks. Now it's a fashion icon. So maybe the myth didn't die because it kept solving different fears for different generations. For example, in times of disease, it explained illness. In times of repression, it embodied desire. In times of wealth disparity, it symbolized elite predation. And in youth obsessed culture, it represents ageless beauty. The vampire evolves with us because it reflects us. But here's the part that makes me pause: the universality. Disconnected civilizations describe something that feeds on life force. It moves at night and it corrupts and drains. Is that coincidence? Is it collective imagination? Or is it cultural memory of something we no longer interpret literally? And even if it is purely, metaphorical, why blood? Why immortality? Why aristocracy? Why this story? Because myths that don't resonate disappear. And as I've said, this one didn't, which means, at the very least, it's anchored to something persistent in the human psyche: the fear of being drained, fear of losing vitality, of unseen predators, desire for eternal power. Metaphor, memory, or something that simply learned to evolve. All right, so here I'm going to slow down for a second because I genuinely don't think the vampire myth is random. The universality alone is weird. We've got separate civilizations separated by oceans and centuries, all landing on the same version of a nocturnal being that feeds on life force. That, at minimum, is interesting. And then the deterrence. We've got the garlic, silver, sunlight, holy symbols, all revolving around purity, protection, and exposure. That tells me vampires have always symbolized corruption, contamination, something invasive, which feels very human. But then we get to the wealth angle. Why are they always aristocrats? Why are they almost never portrayed as struggling, desperate creatures living in alleyways? If you're immortal, sure, you'd accumulate wealth over time. Compound interest alone would carry you, like I said. But the obsession with ancient bloodlines, old castles, inherited power, that feels like we're projecting something. Almost like the vampires are stand-in for elite power structures that feel, I don't know, untouchable. Something ancient, wealthy, something that feeds quietly. And I'm not saying that literally. I'm just saying the metaphor writes itself, right? But here's what keeps me open. The historical panic was real. The reports were real. The exhumations were real. Entire communities were convinced something was straight up happening, right? And yes, we can explain most of it now, most of it. But what I find fascinating is that the myth didn't collapse under scientific progress. It shifted, adapted, modernized. It became seductive instead of grotesque, integrated instead of hunted, right? That's not how dead ideas behave. Dead ideas fade, and this one rebranded, let's be honest. And I don't know if that's because it reflects something psychological that we'll always carry, or because the story is anchored to something older than we fully understand. I'm not saying there's a guy in a cape flying around over your house, at night. I'm just saying, if something had thousands of years to adapt, to refine, to learn from its mistakes, would we even recognize it now? Because remember, these, quote unquote creatures are basically humans. They're not some wild animal. That's the part that keeps me curious. All right, now I want to hear from you, because this is one of those topics where you can land in a very different place depending on what part sticks with you. So let's talk about it. If vampires aren't real, why does almost every culture describe some version of them? Is that just, shared human fear of death and disease, or is it something older that kept resurfacing under different names? Why did the myth evolve instead of disappearing? Most monsters fade when science advances. And again, vampires didn't. They upgraded. What do you think that says? And why are they almost always wealthy and powerful? Is that just logical immortality math, like centuries to build assets? Or is the vampire a metaphor for elite structures that feel ancient and untouchable? What about the deterrents? Garlic, silver, sunlight, holy symbols. Why does purity and exposure keep coming up? Is that symbolic or is that rule based lore that just stuck for some reason? And then the big one, if vampires existed, not Hollywood style, but in some biological or evolved form, would they blend into society quietly? Would they operate in the shadows or would they just rule openly? And be honest, if immortality were real, eternal youth, endless time, accumulated power, but it required feeding on others, would it be worth it? Because that's the, moral fork in the road. And I'm genuinely curious where you land. So, we started with a simple question. If vampires were just superstition, then why has every civilization described them? We walked through ancient cultures, real historical panic, beliefs about blood, the rules about turning, the strange consistency of deterrence, the symbolism of sunlight, the Dracula era transformation, and the way the myth somehow adapted instead of disappearing. And that, to me, is the part that really lingers. The story didn't just stay buried in the past, it kept changing with us. It moved from plague explanation to gothic horror to cultural metaphor to then, modern fascination with immortality, youth, and power. Every generation reshaped it, but no one will let it go, which makes you wonder if something has survived every civilization, maybe it doesn't need to hide in coffins anymore. Maybe it never did. All right, well, that's it for today, but thank you so much for hanging out with me. Before you go, if you're not subscribed to the After Hours newsletter, you are missing out. Every Friday, you'll get a quick episode recap, the quote of the week, a confession from a fellow listener, my personal takeaway from the episode, and of course, the wine behind it all. Speaking of confessions, if you've got one, we want to hear it. It could be a conspiracy you low-key believe, an embarrassing story, or a hot take about literally anything. Whatever it is, we want it, so submit away. You can also pitch episode ideas. So if you've got something you want us to talk about, we are all ears. You can do all of these wonderful things by visiting our website at winenotpod.com. And if you love the show, leave us a review. It really does help more than you think. All right, well, thank you again so much for joining me, and I will see you next week for another wild ride. Bye.